Dr. Iraj Abedian, thank you for being with us. Also, Minister Donald Grant is with us this morning, MEC of Education, Western Cape. Thank you for coming. Also to welcome the members of the diplomatic community, our donors that are with us as well, our IGR board members and representatives of the media, the friends of IGR and supporters of our work. You're all welcome. Thank you very much. Before I hand over to our Executive Director to come up and say a few words, just to make a few announcements, you are welcome to tweet this event. Our hashtag is hashtag TA 2013. So that's hashtag TA 2013. We also have a Facebook page that we've created where you can engage us in conversation, whatever you find interesting out of this event. The Facebook page is /Inclusive Economies. You can like that page and go there and we can start a conversation. Thank you very much. And now it gives me pleasure to welcome our Executive Director, Dr. Fanny du Toit, to say a few words. Thanks, Fanny.
Welcome to our new building here in the CBD of Cape Town. We are very excited to be here. Let me just clarify one thing from the onset. The rental rates here is just the same as in Wynberg. So nothing has happened to our financial situation. In fact, when we first saw this building, it was decidedly derelict because there'd been a publishing house here for several years, 18 years in fact, and it's just gone steadily down. So we took it then, and then the landlord jumped in and put this money in. The result in the end is this wonderful building. So we really hope this venue will become a space where South Africans can debate issues of real importance across from Parliament. We've first, we threw our gates open to Parliament. We're delighted to be across, and now we're thinking we should begin to barricade our gates after the State of the Nation debate. We're not quite sure what will come across the street, but that's the effort of IGR to be relevant, to be in town, to be where the debates are, and we hope we can, in some modest way, also contribute as a forum for this. Now this morning we are launching the Transformation Audit, our annual economic report, and Jan Hofmeyr, who's the editor, together with Ayanda Nyoka, they're a team of two that's brought this publication out. We'll say more about this as we go on. Perhaps just for me to say that, I think that with the father of the nation, Nelson Mandela's passing last year, we as a nation did very publicly commit ourselves to this concept of reconciliation again. It was somewhat surprising because preceding that event, there was a sense that we have become disillusioned with reconciliation, and yet there was a very public outpouring in support of reconciliation when Madiba passed. But one senses that the meaning of the term had actually shifted from the 1990s, when it meant, I think, something like we have to learn to live together in this country. We have to accept that we're white and black together, to much more emphasis on socioeconomic redress as an absolute essential prerequisite for living together. That this living together cannot proceed on the unequal basis that we have with us at the moment. The TRC then was, if one looks back, a necessary but not efficient platform to debate what this would look like. And so we are now looking at new platforms, new opportunities. And IGR in its own way is focused on this for the last few years, from board level, where as late as 2 days ago we had an intense discussion on whether we as an organization are in fact relevant, and where we are relevant and how we're relevant to this issue. And that conversation is ongoing. We have 3 projects. The one is the Inclusive Economies project, which Ayanda Nyoka heads, and which looks at, which looks at ways, the bottlenecks in terms of expanding the economy in South Africa to include everyone. The South African Reconciliation Barometer, that Kim Whale heads up at the back there, provides us with the statistics to show what South Africans think about this. And then we have our Building Inclusive Society project that works with communities on the ground over a long period of time with a basic premise that social cohesion is a bonus when it comes to development. That if you go into a little rural town and you see the racial divisions, that we assume that that cannot be a productive unit for development unless there is sufficient social cohesion built across these boundaries. And that is what the Building Inclusive Society project does. Consensus that we now need to move forward with poverty reduction, but that consensus in this country is not translated into a pro-poor reality. We know that. And in the President's speech, he made the point, the State of the Nation address, that South Africa is a much better place under apartheid. I think we can agree with that. The point is that we have not lived up to our own expectations of what we would have been by now. And I think to outdo apartheid is perhaps not the point. The point is what our own expectations also are in terms of going forward. And the majority of South Africans remain economically disempowered. The youth faces a fragile future. So what is it that we need now? We have many diagnoses, and today we're going to listen to Iraj speaking about his diagnosis of where the problems are. Fascinating diagnosis, I think, that links social and economic capital with one another in very interesting ways. We need to agree on measures, and we need to have urgency. And I think one of the things that we have lacked over the last decade or two has been to have the same urgency that we have in terms of political settlement, also for economic poverty reduction. We had the flames literally licking at us from the behind when we were settling our politics, and we managed to do it. And somehow we've gone off the boil when it comes to poverty reduction. It may yet have to get to the point where the flames are licking us also before we actually have that urgency. Or could we take a shortcut? Pius Langa spoke at the opening of the launch of our institute in 2000, and he said that the Constitution is not a future document. Then he said, and I quote, "It is a now document." And the extent to which we're urgently implementing the constitutional vision, to that extent this document will survive. We're 20 years down the line. And I think we are now faced with an assessment this year of how urgently we've been focused on poverty reduction in this country. With those words, welcome again to our HQ now here in the city. I wish you all a productive morning, and I hope that we'll see you all pop in and out here. We hope lots of people will come and go, that this is really a space we can use for public debate in the center of Cape Town. Thank you, Ayanda.
I call up Dr. Iraj to come and speak to us and share his thoughts with us on this theme of intergenerational equity as we look forward to the budget speech next week. I'd like to just give a brief introduction of who Dr. Iraj is for those perhaps who don't know who he is. First to say that Dr. Iraj has contributed an article in this TA of 2013 on intergenerational equity, which Jan is going to talk to that later on when he does the launch. He's also the CEO of I got it wrong the last time, so I have to get it right this time around. CEO of Pan-African Investment and Research, and they are based in Joburg. He holds a PhD from Simon Fraser University in Canada, is a non-executive director of Pan-African Capital Holdings. He was also economic advisor for the Eskisa program, board member of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. And now it gives me a great honor to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Iraj Abedian, to come and address us. Thank you very much.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, possibly more importantly, friends. I'm grateful to the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation for giving me this opportunity to share some thoughts on the concept of intergenerational equity. I hope I'll be able to persuade you that a full understanding of intergenerational equity issues is one of our critical and overarching challenges in South Africa today. Whilst congratulating the IJR for the publication of its Transformation Audit 2013, I should also underline the point that the timing of the launch of this audit could hardly be any more apt as we move from our customary State of Nation address of the President, which happened on February 13, to the forthcoming budget speech next week on the 26th. This is a period filled with debates on key strategic issues facing the nation, the country and its economy, to deal with the critical subjects of economic exclusion, which is the subject matter of this TA 2013, we need to effectively address the underlying drivers of the phenomenon. The symptoms of the systematic economic exclusion are evident in widely acknowledged triple evils of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. In my view, the neglect of the intergenerational equity issues over the past 20 years of our democracy in South Africa has been one of the major contributors to the emergence of a systemic and structural socioeconomic exclusion within our society. It is high time that we as a nation honestly reflect on the lessons that we have learned from our own 20 years of democratic policy experimentation. So, let's begin with a short discussion of concept of intergenerational equity. As I mentioned, I've had the privilege of contributing a chapter to this publication, so a lot of details are there. For those of you who may think that I'm crossing over the details and being glib, may I invite you to check that chapter. So I'm going to stay, given time constraints that I have, with the take-home messages and leave the details to those who are interested to check the facts. These simple but factual realities do have far-reaching consequences for the success of our society going forward. Intergenerational equity is a complex issue in public policy, essentially and especially when it is seen through the lenses of political economy, philosophy, applied ethics, as well as public policy. More often than not, the notion is invoked in discourses around environmental sustainability and or in the politics of public debt. We often talk about transgenerational equity. The concept, however, is much deeper and wider in scope. Intergenerational equity encompasses a variety of important issues. This is so because the society is the intermediary amongst the past, present, and future generations. All social processes, be they political, economic, technological, ethical, or environmental, have a systemic and dynamic impact upon the overlapping generations' welfare. At the same time, human beings, all of us, are predominantly present-oriented. In effect, we discount the future heavily. The more distant it is, or it is perceived to be. This means generally for human beings, the present is more important than the near future, and the near future is more important than distant future. Furthermore, human activities and enterprises are more often than not subject to uncertainty and incomplete information. These are very simple facts. And yet these simple facts do have profound and far-reaching consequences for the success and failure of nations. I have in my research referred to some of the recent books that have come out in the past 2 decades, documenting across regions and across cultures, races, and histories to demonstrate the importance of these simple facts to the success or failure, prosperity or misery of nations. Moreover, our use of natural resources, our approaches to the ecosystem, and commitment to the refinement of the political economy institutions, and the social and ethical framework we promote, and the ease with which we commit resources to social and human integrity, are all affected by our implicit or explicit regard for the principle of intergenerational equity. For South Africa at this juncture, in its social democratic evolution, intergenerational equity has an added significance. 2 decades into the foundational years of its new democratic dispensation, compelling evidence and complicated syndromes of disregard for intergenerational equity are emerging in South Africa. Far from the failure of the public education system, the widespread collusion and extractive conduct among the business corporations, to the near collapse of the public sector administration, especially at the local government level, glaring and worrisome signs are evident that social welfare across generations is being disregarded and even compromised. So, what is intergenerational equity? In recent years, intergenerational issues related to the ecosystem have received much attention under a variety of topics. For environmentalists and economists, the operative word is sustainability. Whenever we talk about intergenerational issues, the term sustainability pops up. The concept of sustainability has a long tradition in academic economic literature, dating back to the 18th century, when the sole concern when it came to sustainability was the ability of the earth, the Mother Earth, to provide sustenance for a growing population. The Malthusian paradigm that we are familiar with. In modern times, however, it was the Brundtland report titled Our Common Future in 1987, which placed the intergenerational equity at the center of the global political economy discourse. The report often quoted definition. There is a definition in this report which is often quoted, and it goes along the following lines. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet its own needs. That's the end of the quote. As important as the natural resources are the human-made resources and capabilities that collectively constitute a dynamic and ever-advancing civilization. In economic literature, this is often referred to as the made capital. For those amongst you who are into econometrics, anybody who has done some econometric modeling, you always have to provide for natural endowment, which is made of your natural resources, and your inherited made capital. And that is in contrast with natural endowment, minerals, land, sea, etc., etc. For each generation, then, the national resource or capital endowment is made of the natural endowment plus the inherited made capital. In this research and in this regard, each generation's heritage subsumes vital components such as culture, knowledge, socio-economic and political institutions, logistical infrastructure, and the effective governing legal paradigm. Social capital is a critical component of made capital. The reality of the social structure and its evolution over time is that both benefits and costs are more often than not externalized. In effect, neither the full benefit nor the full costs of a given generation's decisions are borne by itself and its members. Therefore, the substance of intergenerational equity is complex and its operational environment are made of both tangible and intangible. Importantly, the implications are not merely theoretical or academic. The future trajectory of the society's development path is largely defined by the depth of our understanding and commitments to intergenerational equity. The operational intricacies of distributive justice multiply when we intersect the above principle of transgenerational equity or morality with the intragenerational maldistribution of resources. The poverty issues that we have to grapple with at the same time that we have to worry about what we bequeath to our children. At the heart of the controversies and complexity of redistributive justice lies the assumption made about the nature of human beings, on the one hand, and the political economic construct of the society on the other. Furthermore, the fact that these two themselves are the two, I mean the nature of human being as well as the nature of the institutions, political economy institutions, they intersect. It makes the matrix even more complex. With regard to the nature of human beings, two polar assumptions have been driven the entire philosophical, psychological, and political economy research right through the history. And all of us know from the turbulent 60s and 70s and 80s, globally I'm speaking, not just South Africa, the so-called the right and the left perspectives. Now let's just dig in about these assumptions that are made by the left and the right about the nature of human beings. A book that I strongly recommend, 2007, by Eric Beinhocker, summarizes the issues as follows, and I quote, "If one digs deeply into the left-right divide, down to its philosophical and historic core, one finds two conflicting views of human nature. On the left is the view that human beings are inherently altruistic, that greed and selfishness stem not from human nature, but from the construction of the social order, and that humans can be made better through a more just society. The lineage of this view descends from Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Karl Marx. On the right is the view that human beings are inherently self-regarding, and that the pursuit of self-interest is an inalienable right. The most effective system of governance is the one that accommodates rather than attempts to change this aspect of human beings. The right claims, however, that if people pursue their self-interest through the mechanism of markets, then the general interest of society will be served as well. The lineage of this view descends from Hume, John Locke, and Thomas Hobbes. So these are the two perspectives that we have had, if you want to be honest with ourselves, as researchers, thinkers, social activists, and so on. Socio-political experimentations based on the assumptions of the left and the right have both failed to bring about an order that is capable of dealing satisfactorily with redistributive justice issues. It is no exaggeration to argue that both contemporaneous as well as intergenerational equity have been made worse if judged by the prevailing disparities of wealth and income as well as the compounded crisis of ecological and sustainability concerns. Clearly, a new paradigm based on an alternative and a more nuanced perspective on human nature is needed. Modern scientific research in psychology, economics, anthropology, and game theory has highlighted the serious flaws in the simplistic assumptions made by both the left and the right about human nature. The nature of human beings, research suggests, recent research, has a blend of the conditional cooperator with the altruistic punisher. There is a body of literally a mountain and rising mountain of literature coming from various disciplines converging on this very interesting insight. This critical revision of our assumption about the nature of human beings opens up a new paradigm of thinking and the vast range of consequent systemic capabilities and potentialities. Together with a range of other recent research in the fields of thermodynamics, networks, dynamic systems evolution, analytics of disequilibrium economics, and empirical psychology, the strong reciprocity assumption, which is critical for the society of not just human beings, but also beings, full stop. The strong reciprocity assumption paves the way for what is currently known as complexity economics. Complexity economics is a clear and substantive departure from nearly 4 centuries of traditional economics, reflected primarily but not exclusively in neoclassical economic analysis. I must say I spent 20 years of my life teaching neoclassical economics. I spent 10 years learning it, and now I spend a few years trying to learn what was wrong with it. Meanwhile, and in the immediate future, the requirements of intergenerational equity entail the balancing of human attributes, namely the conditional cooperator with the altruistic punisher. I submit that these two assumptions have incredible and tangible application to the resolution of some of the problems that we face in South Africa in our next phase of reconciliation and reconstruction. Arthur Dole, he was the director of UN Environmental and Sustainability Program for many years, a respected author. He says, "We desire a world of peace and prosperity, but much of economic and psychological theory depicts human beings as slaves of self-interest. Yet it can be argued that well-being for everyone necessitates a more just and sustainable social order. This would require qualities like moderation, justice, love, reason, sacrifice, and service to the human and common good, which must be harnessed to overcome the traits of ego, greed, apathy, and violence, which are often rewarded by the market and political forces, driving current patterns of unsustainable consumption and production, in which the well-being of a few is attained at the expense of the many. A new social contract must have a broader view of human well-beings founded on ethical principles." End of the quote. In pursuit of our new thinking paradigm, 2 attributes of the social order are of critical relevance. The first attribute is that the political economy system is dynamic. Scientifically, this means the system's current state is strongly related to its previous state, and its future state is a function of its current state. By way of illustration, consider a country's national stock of capital, a critical variable in determining actual and expected growth rates. Capital accumulation is a dynamic process. The rate at which the national stock of capital is increased or decreased will be determined by the stock of capital at the start of the period, the so-called initial conditions. The rate of capital accumulation or destruction during the period. The same analysis holds for unemployment, for savings, technological progress, the development of the country's commercial jurisprudence, the evolution of accountability and legal institution, and numerous other processes. Please note I'm using the term dynamics in a far more disciplined way than we usually loosely talk about everything is dynamic, which means everything is in the air. That is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the decision that made before us affects what we can do today, what we do or not do, build or destroy today will affect the conditions of our children. The second attribute is that within the complex web of the political economy systems, there are countless processes with feedback loops at the same time. This means, feedback loop means, developments in one dynamic process influences another set of processes within the system. For example, what happens to the investment process has direct implications for employment or unemployment, capital accumulation, growth rates, savings, and other processes. These effects are both contemporaneous as well as transgenerational. Now, the dynamic nature of the political economy structures therefore has profound implications for both pecuniary and non-pecuniary variables. I make a big issue in my submission that we need to distinguish between pecuniary, meaning financial, monetary, quantifiable, and non-pecuniary, which are non-financial, equally important capital, and there are significant so-called non-pecuniary variables that govern intergenerational equity. This is not what neoclassical economics is talking about or prepared to talk about. These are some of the departures for those who are interested in the economic nuances. The interaction between politics and the economy, the governing institutions, and the culture of citizens' participation in the society are critical factors in the process of failure or success of nations. A significant contributor with long-term impact on sustainability of social development and human prosperity is the embedded value system that manifests within society's operations. Such values and codes of conduct need not be legislated or somewhat formalized. Rather, they need to be internalized within the society's political economy organs. With the help of such values, social trust is engendered, and over time, social capital is created, maintained, and augmented. Intergenerational prosperity is dependent as much on social capital as it is on financial and technological capital. The co-evolution of these two forms of capital ultimately leads to and is required for sustainable development across generations. In this paradigm of complexity economics, four protagonists are the primary contributors to intergenerational prosperity, and of course the inverse of it, misery. And these four are: one, the national resource endowment. As I mentioned before, it's natural resources and made capital. Number two, the individual, you and I. Number three, the political economy institutions. And number four, the society as defined by its embedded value system, which is formally and or informally espoused. What I have in mind is not what the Constitution says, what a particular legislation says, what a politician's speech says is important, but it's not nearly as relevant as what we do, how we reveal that embedded value system, how we live it. Talk, as it said, is easy. It's the action that tests our resolve and tests who we are and how much we are committed or otherwise to a particular piece of the Constitution and or our own value systems. So these four protagonists are the four pillars of intergenerational equity, which either leads to prosperity or results in opposite of prosperity, the misery of nations. The empirical quantification of the foregoing aspects of intergenerational equity is not readily available. At the moment, this is the avant-garde of research. Economic, as well as sociology, as well as political scientists, applied psychology is trying to find ways and means of quantifying these components of intergenerational equity. The empirical quantification is not readily available. There are, however, some aspects that lend themselves to tracking the proxy indicators. And what I've tried to do in a very humble and tentative way is to suggest that there are ways of tracking these indicators. So let's look at tracking some of these cross-generational or intragenerational resource allocation issues. Among the quantitative indicators of intergenerational equity is the aggregate level of investment or savings. For economists at macro level, savings and investments are the two sides of the same coin, which is done by each generation in ensuring the sustainability of growth over time. National savings is an important intergenerational variable insofar as savings are the key source of funding for national investment. Without investments, economic growth is a near impossibility. In the absence of adequate national savings, investment in the national economy have to rely on foreign capital flows into the economy. Imported capital in turn can be fickle and footloose. More seriously, when a country is dependent on imported capital for a significant share of its national investment requirement, this in turn creates ongoing currency volatility, financial market sensitivities to domestic and socio-political dynamics. There is no particular level of aggregate investment which is technically optimal or universally applicable across the various phases of business cycle and technological waves. That said, the rule of thumb in economic development history suggests that over time, for the sake of sustainable growth, each country should spend on average between 5 to 8% of its GDP, in its socio-economic infrastructure. South Africa's average national investment as a ratio of GDP has fallen from its height of 7% in mid-70s, 1970s, to the current level of below 3%. This sustained underinvestment has created a cumulative gap in the required stock of socioeconomic infrastructure, which in turn has undermined growth and retarded social development. For those who create a dichotomy between social development and economic growth, have you heard that? How much fight we do about we want good development or we want good growth? This is a false neoclassical debate. Complexity economics says get real. Look at the reality of the issues. So our growth and our development, both the two sides of the coin, is severely affected by this suboptimal and sustained underinvestment in our national infrastructure. From mid-1970s to now, it's almost over 40 years. At the time of the writing, some of the manifestations of this backlog, and this is a cumulative backlog at present, is the lack of adequate energy, roads, export logistics, and public education and health facilities, and urban amenities. Furthermore, for a number of years to come, it is highly likely that the country will struggle to catch up with the cumulative backlog. South Africa's portfolio of natural endowment is heavily resource-based. By that I mean minerals and land. It's a vast country with huge disproportional endowment of mineral resources. As such, development and sustainability of its growth depends heavily on well-planned and appropriately sequenced stock of complementary infrastructure. Not only does it need adequate and reliable energy, it simultaneously needs rail, harbor, water, and human skills, amongst others. So the level of investment per se is only one requirement. The other is to get the mix, the scale, and the timing of such investments right. Next to infrastructure investment trends, the stock of public debt and its relative magnitude constitute one of the most commonly debated intergenerational statistics. South Africa's public debt trends remains fairly benign. However, from an intergenerational perspective, whilst public debt remains prudent, the ratios at the moment hovering around 30-odd to 40%, we'll hear the facts next week, the stock of national socio-economic infrastructure also remains considerably below social optimal level. If seen as a national balance sheet, it can be argued that the asset side of the ledger, that is the stock of infrastructure, is woefully weak with accumulated backlogs, whilst the liability side, which is the national debt, is moderate at the moment. The former inhibits the actual and expected growth, which in turn and over time causes material sustainability concerns for government debt. Current and future generations are set to suffer welfare losses as a result. How often do we brag about the fact that our debt to GDP is wonderful? And I, guilty as charged, as one of those who did the same. And yet, this is a very one-sided and possibly flawed interpretation of this ratio, because that's just the liability side. The asset side of it is that whilst we are not bequeathing to future generations much debt, we are not bequeathing to them much capability to have a better life. The most serious issue surrounding South Africa's public debt is not its level or its relative size to GDP. but rather the quality of public expenditure. In effect, liabilities accumulate and there is little corresponding addition of social welfare for the present generation and the promise of future growth and welfare for generations to come. A further breakdown of fiscal expenditure reveals additional insights into the composition of public expenditure and its intergenerational implications. Education, obviously, is the most significant intergenerational item of budgetary allocation. Over the period 1995 to last year, 2013, on average 20% of government expenditure or budget is allocated to this vital investment in future generations. A further disaggregation of the education budget reveals a sound allocation of resources among the various cohorts of the younger generations. Judged by the aggregate budgetary allocation to education or assessed in terms of the intergenerational allotment to the various types of education, South Africa's fiscal allocations are sound and in line with principles of intergenerational equity. However, the problem arises with the quality of education. Widespread shortage of skills within the society is but one of its manifestations after nearly 20 years of the country's democratic dispensation. It is a fact that the modernization and technological upgrading of the economy post-1994 have increased the economy's skills intensity. Meanwhile, the country's human capital development policy has remained oblivious to this critical fact. Whilst much has been done to promote access to the public schooling system, and often our politicians brag about it, little has been achieved with regard to the quality improvement of the educations offered. I'm talking about the curriculum, the competitiveness of the content of the education. Consequently, unemployability, widespread vacancies, and huge skill gaps have emerged concurrently. The upward mobility of the poor has been curtailed. Hence, their participation in the economy is severely undermined. The poor and their offspring who rely on public schooling have been trapped in the vicious cycle of poverty and dependency. Within the country, the so-called second economy has expanded as a result. This was a term that President Mbeki coined to capture the social phenomenon of inability to participate in the formal economy. I submit that our current human resource development policy is set to perpetuate the second economy phenomenon for a long time to come. At present, there is no credible solution for this critical structural anti-poor and intergenerational inequity factor. We are being very unfair to our future generations. Of course, there are many expressions of concern and numerous initiatives to deal with the various aspects of the education crisis in the country in a piecemeal manner. Yet all these expressions and interventions fade into insignificance in relation to the enormity of the challenge facing the country in eliminating one of the most important systemic contributors to the anti-poor and intergenerational injustice of South Africa's public policy architecture. It is stating the obvious that the issue is profoundly political, and as yet no political leader since 1994 has had the vision and or the courage to tackle it effectively. Put differently, no sizable black middle class has arisen yet to create the necessary political pressure for change in the public education system. The rich, both black and white, opt out of the public education system, and the poor are unable and helpless in holding the government accountable. Next to education, the budgetary spend on social protection is the next item with significant intergenerational consequences. Social welfare has been the fastest growing expenditure category over the past decade and a half. With the expansion and extension of child welfare grant to the age of 17, which was announced in October 2009, this budgetary item has been set to rise sharply. It is a matter of time before welfare expenditure exceeds that of expenditure on education, which is the largest budgetary allocation within the national budget. It is noteworthy that since 2000, the share of child grants has consistently increased in the budget. Government's expenditure mix is bound to continue in favor of welfare spending. Over the next 3 to 5 years, a growing level of fiscal stress is likely to emerge. We will see the first manifestations of it next week. I'm not a double-sided economist. I'm prepared to be very single-handed at this point in time. Over the next 3 to 5 years, a growing level of fiscal stress is likely to emerge primarily as a result of the trade-offs between welfare expenditure and socioeconomic infrastructure expenditure. This will be more so if GDP growth rates fall and stay below 3%. The further from the 3% we become, the faster this fiscal stress will mount. The creation and augmentation of human capital is essential for breaking out of the vicious cycle of poverty. Historic evidence suggests that it takes at least 1 generation to make a real dent in systemic poverty, provided a sound education system operates within a well-integrated national human resource development strategy. This is a key plank of a platform for sustainable socioeconomic stability and intergenerational upward mobility. Seen in the context of the calculus of overlapping generations, assets and liabilities, at present, the low returns on education investment together with the ballooning child/youth grants expenditure constitute a sure liability for future generations without a corresponding revenue generating capability. So we're spending the money on education, but we are not creating the capability to earn 10, 15, 20 years down the line. The extension of this grant to the unemployed youth has both sociological as well as fiscal implications. As mentioned earlier, socioeconomic processes are dynamic with feedback loops. These are jargons, but they are very realistic. The poor education system and its resultant low skill base of the country's labor force leads to a low productivity, low wage syndrome. So it's not by accident that labor analysts continuously, and quite frankly labor unions completely complain about low wage syndrome. But they forget about the other side of the ledger, which is the low productivity and where it comes from, and to the extent that they are contributing to this dynamic process, they being the unions themselves. This in turn leads to households' financial vulnerability and the low and suboptimal national savings rate. Savings consumption behavioral patterns are by nature intergenerational. In other words, in general, it's difficult to change savings patterns in the short term. The foregoing trends, what I shared with you, point to a fairly problematic, if not worrisome, pattern with regard to the intergenerational equitability of resource allocation. And all of these fall into what I call it pecuniary trends. These are the numbers that we can this is my time. These are all the pecuniary issues. Such pecuniary trends are indicative of a political economy policy paradigm that discounts future generations' welfare heavily. As a corollary, the current generation places an undue premium on its own consumption and well-being. In the process, deep distortions and systemic complications in the political economy are created too. Now, how about the non-pecuniary investments? You recall I mentioned there are 2 planks of our social progress. Pecuniary ones are these, non-pecuniary ones. Important as the pecuniary variables are, public debt, education, etc., etc., so too are the non-pecuniary investments for the well-being of future generations. At one end, non-pecuniary variables pertain to foundational institutions of the socio-political economic institutions. At the other end, they relate to the significance of promoting social and personal value systems that help lay the ground for defining the nation, its social culture, its internalized moral and ethical code, and its national welfare objectives. Through the interplay of these 2 subsystems, socio-political institutions and social and personal value systems, through the interplay of these 2 subsystems of the non-pecuniary network of variables, social capital may be created or destroyed. Contemporary research has underscored the importance of social capital as a critical ingredient of a sustainable political economy framework. The promotion of trust among diverse stakeholders is a key ingredient in the process of social capital formation. This is particularly so in heterogeneous societies like South Africa. We have 18, 19 tribes. The accumulation of social trust augments intergenerational social capital via an array of interrelated processes that inter alia includes transgenerational conversations within the family structures, the workplace, the community initiatives, and non-profit organizations. The promotion of reciprocity for the common good is a vital element of intergenerational social capital accumulation. South African constitutional democracy has been recognized as a progressive platform for the establishment and maintenance of an inclusive social development system. The Bill of Rights, together with the separation of powers amongst the legislative, the executive, and the judicial arms of government, are the essential pillars of the democratic dispensation. Furthermore, South Africa's modern history, and I'm going a bit fast because of Ayanda, South Africa's modern history has been synonymous with an independent South African Reserve Bank and a credible and active Auditor General Office. The establishment of both the Office of Public Protector and the National Prosecuting Agency have further strengthened the constellation of the governance institutions, promoting accountability, access to justice, and the protection of property rights. These are vital requirements for creating a political economy system of governance that has the promise of facilitating a prosperous socio-economic dispensation with resilient intergenerational prospects. By design, South African government institutions are inclusive. Furthermore, the country has a well-established and a century-old judicial system with a credible and tested jurisprudence. Operationally, however, in recent years, there is a growing concern about the over-politicization of some of these institutions for partisan and individual gains. Corruption and criminality have manifested themselves widely across both the private and public entities. Over the past 5 years, 2 successive commissioners of police, a number of ministers and premiers, as well as some high-profile members of the provincial executive committees called MECs, have been caught in corrupt activities. Private sector entities ranging from construction, manufacturing to telecommunication firms have been found guilty of collusive and extractive behavior. State-owned enterprises and agencies likewise have been riddled with cases of ongoing misuse, abuse, and corrupt use of their public resources. The most recent survey of the perception of corruption across various sectors in South Africa reveals a disturbing pattern. It may not be an exaggeration to suggest that the 2 interrelated phenomena of corruption and crime have been the topmost blights on the face of an otherwise successful, if not wondrous, democratic transition in South Africa. Increasingly, it is evident that the South African liberation movement's social democratic revolution is tripped up by corruption. There is a growing danger that not dealing effectively with corruption could lead to the institutionalization of corruption, the rationalization of corrupt practices, and the taking root of a culture of greed and self-enrichment at all costs. In effect, institutions that are designed for and intended to roll out an inclusive and accountable socio-political dispensation for the future generations are captured by extractive practices for the opportunistic material gains by the current generation's political elite in public and private sector. For intragenerational equity and sustainable prosperity, an effective check on poverty is a key imperative. Nearly 20 years into the democratic dispensation, the failure with regard to poverty eradication is the single most prominent concern in the context of intergenerational welfare and equity. Not only in absolute terms, but also in global comparative context, South Africa has a serious poverty problem. The raising of public sector productivity is a prerequisite for the ability of the economy both to tackle poverty and to raise wage levels for the working classes. The logjam between organized labor and government over the past decade has been one of the key contributors to the declining productivity in the public sector. By not creating and facilitating a public service working environment conducive to performance, we have seen a deepening of a culture of mediocrity and bureaucratic formalities within the public sector. This is inimical to poverty eradication, sustainable growth, and transgenerational social development. When the culture of mediocrity sets in, it takes decades to eliminate, and generations suffer as a result. These government failures belong to the non-pecuniary intergenerational issues and must be addressed urgently. They equally apply to the private sector. It's not just the government sector. The desired outcome is fairly easy to define. The National Development Plan, NDP, defines this as a capable state. To achieve these outcomes, the public sector's necessary requirement is an extensive professionalization. A further and complementary requisite is the incorporation of a code of ethical conduct within the sector. These are vital ingredients of a medium to long-term poverty eradication strategy. Much like poverty, public sector inefficiency has many causal roots. It is often tempting to attribute such organizational inefficiencies to a single and elegant factor, such as affirmative action. You blame it. The empirical studies worldwide suggest otherwise. One factor amongst the primary contributors, however, is the rift between the country's socio-economic, formal or professed, as opposed to informal or practiced ethics. This duality is not unique to the public sector either. South Africa is trapped in an evident value duality quagmire. We say something, we subscribe to something, we do something else. Madiba passes on, we all are suddenly agents of reconciliation. We go to the office and we do something else. We go to the family and do something else. We go to the corporate and do something else. That is what I'm talking to about formal or professed as opposed to informal and practiced. This duality is not unique to the public sector either. South Africa is trapped into an evident value duality quagmire with considerable socio-political consequences, especially for the poor and for their offsprings. The duality of values has been accentuated by the process of socio-political transformation. In general, it's much easier to create convergence of values in homogeneous societies, as opposed to communities where tribal, cultural, religious, and ideological differences prevail. The absence of a code of honor ultimately leads to corruption in one or other form. Corruption in the society acts much like a cancer in the human body. If not stopped, will spread. Whilst initially some acts of corruption may even be deemed to be expedient, their ultimate and cumulative effect will be detrimental to the development path of the society. Most significantly, corruption erodes the moral authority of the state and the party in power. There is convincing and growing evidence that the facts as well as the allegations of corruption in South Africa have gradually tarnished internal and external perceptions of the state operations as well as the political authority of the government. As a result, the citizens, and more so the poor's, trust in government has been considerably undermined. Whilst the economy and the society at large suffer the consequences of widespread corruption, the poor within the society bear the brunt of its impact. After all, the poor are far more dependent on the performance of the public sector. The rising disparity of income, the growing gap between the rich and the poor over the past decade is in part due to the growing spread of corruption across all sectors and the spheres of the economy. It is hard to overemphasize the destructive effects of corruption in the society. This systemic bias against the poor and against future generations remains highly problematic in today's South Africa. It entails considerable adverse effects on intergenerational equity and social inequity. The last but no means the least of the systemic anti-transgenerational equity and upward mobility factors in today's South Africa is the nature of our economic growth and its inherent limitations. Since 1994, there has been a growing recognition that for the country to make a meaningful dent in poverty eradication, sustainable job creation, and the promotion of transgenerational upward mobility, the average sustainable growth has to be lifted to a multiple of what it is registered today. This means the country needs an average GDP growth rate of between 6 to 9%, sustained over a period of 15 to 20 years. For such growth levels to be real and a real possibility, there is a need for a much higher level of social trust as well as stakeholder convergence on approaches on economic growth and development. The contested and fractured approaches to economic policy making since 1994 has become almost one of the defining features of public policy making in South Africa. The opportunity cost of this modus operandi is considerable, and for the poor it is unbearable. Future generations are set to suffer the consequences accordingly. I'm referring to the minute that the government policy comes out, there is no shortage of people who want to shoot it down and make sure it fails. Whether it's within the COSATU, whether it's in the opposition parties, whether it's in business, it matters not. For the poverty alleviation, when you have such fractured situation, nothing gets done. And we all, the hotlying and boss-brothing and opposing and so on, in the meantime, the poor suffer. The above analysis of non-pecuniary elements of intergenerational equity is by no means exhaustive. Rather, it is illustrative of a select number of factors highlighting the fact that in addition to quantifiable variables such as investment in multi-generational infrastructure and the quantum of public debt bequeathed to future generations, there are other foundational variables that do not lend themselves to statistical quantifications, yet they are key to the success or failure of economic prosperity and social development of future generations. So how do we rebalance it? We are focused on we are focused on the present generation, we are captured by those who are connected in the future generation, we are neglecting the future generation. It is safe to argue that South Africa's political economy resource allocation is heavily tilted in favor of the current generation. Moreover, intergenerational resource allocation is in favor of the urban and the politically connected elites. Rebalancing this distorted configuration requires first and foremost the establishment and the promotion of a sustainable and prosperous South African socio-economic political system. Configuring the society for success over time and across generation is the overarching challenge. This topic has been the subject of much scientific and historic research in the recent past. Critically, the two interrelated portals of intergenerational equity are the family and the education system. For both intergenerational and intergenerational value transmission, role model setting, and cultural inclusion, the family fulfills an indispensable and irreplaceable function. In many respects, the foundation of success in ethical, emotional, and cultural evolution is laid within the family. The education system, in turn, reinforces this complex process with a systematic expansion in both cognitive and deductive capabilities. The compatibility of these two portals is particularly critical for social formations over time. These norms collectively and interactively help define the socio-political business milieu over time, helps create an upward mobile transgenerational social order. As noted earlier, South Africa at present faces a serious crisis of social value system. To turn the prevailing divide between formal and informal, or professed and practiced, within the South African society requires resolute business and socio-political leadership. A key portal in this regard is the quality and functionality of education system, capable of imparting not only skills, but one which also fosters active and responsible citizenship. Clearly, this is not a goal that government on its own can achieve. A much broader set of national capabilities has to be brought to bear on the subject. However, government has a critical role to play in this regard. To this end, a conscious depoliticization of the public service is the first and necessary step. This needs to be further reinforced by a political and management leadership whose actions are congruent with their formal policy pronouncements. At the same time, and I'm about to finish, at the same time, business leadership as well as labor unions and the broader social groupings have equally significant parts to play. Their commitment to and the promotion of an explicit value system is critical for changing the current pernicious culture of national resource utilization. Such are the challenges of intergenerational equity in South Africa today. To conclude, the transgenerational policy framework in South Africa faces many challenges. The toughest of them arises from the absence of a set of well-defined and generally accepted ethical and moral values. As the forefathers of economics have convincingly argued, no socio-economic system is sustainable, let alone prosperous, without a set of moral values that are generally internalized across the society. Democratic South Africa is no exception. That we are a different country, we have a different history, is all irrelevant. In the absence of a coherent ethical code of honor and practice, the poor suffer. The elite benefit materially, but their welfare remains at risk. Future generations, meanwhile, are set to suffer the consequences of inaction today. In this light, it is a matter of grave concern that the National Development Plan (NDP) remains silent on the importance of ethics for economic growth and social prosperity. That's the missing chapter. In fact, I would argue that it would have been most appropriate to begin the NDP with a discussion of the role of ethics and moral conduct, especially by those in public office, for social progress. This chapter of the NDP is conspicuous by its absence. Intergenerational equity is a complex, multifaceted notion which is easier said than done. In general, when resource allocation is tilted in favor of the present generation, it is harder to correct the imbalance than the other way around. Visionary and resolute political and social leadership is required to achieve this goal. A range of institutional, systematic, social and individual changes are called for. Within the analytical paradigm of complexity economics, I'm convinced that the evolution of the complex adaptive system of socioeconomic structures require a set of norms for success. The adoption of such norms defines the current and likely drivers of competitive advantage and social progress over time. South Africa has one past, but numerous futures. Which one will be realized depends on the decisions we make today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Iraj, for your incisive insights on the issue of intergenerational equity. I certainly think that it's an issue that bears significance for all of us in the various sectors. I think for me, the great issue that we really need to start thinking about is the issue of human capital and the skills deficit. I think that bears great significance when we're thinking about this theme of intergenerational equity. Okay, so what we're going to do now, even though we are running behind schedule, just a few minutes, is to give an opportunity for people to ask questions and engage with Dr. Iraj, but also to say for the members of the media that are here today, if you do want to have your one-on-one sessions, your in-depth interviews, an opportunity will be offered after we are done. You just need to chat to Zian, the lady in black in front. She's our media coordinator, and then she'll assist you with that regard. I think we do have a mic there for questions.
Terry Bell, Inside Labour, Fin 24 and City Press these days. This intergenerational equity, Dr. Abedian, seems to me to be a philosophical concept that's completely at odds with the free market or capitalist ethos, which actually demands constant competition, maximization of profit, and therefore leads to the absurd situation we're in today of overproduction, overcapacity, which in turn leads again to a race to the bottom in terms of health, safety, and wages, and leads ultimately to warfare between different groups. That's the first point. The second one, I think you were slightly wrong with the talk of left-right. I think you really meant liberal and conservative, and you could have used Burke and Hobbes there, who were philosophers who maintained Burke's case that human beings were inherently altruistic, Hobbes that they were inherently selfish. The right, of course, does believe in the inherent, immutable nature of human beings. The left, certainly not Rousseau and most definitely not Marx, tended to believe that the majority of people are born with different potentials genetically, but that these potentials are developed, and the values, the ethics you talked about, are actually inculcated through the society, the environment, political, social and economic in which they are raised. Therefore, we need surely a radical transformation of a system that is clearly beyond its sell-by date.
Can you comment just on the intersection between gender, sexual orientation and gender identity and levels of poverty?
Hi. You speak about the missing chapter in the National Development Plan, and when you're talking about complex adaptive systems, the need for a small set of rules. Now, what would you say these rules would be? And how do you find these small set of values?
Thanks very much. Mr. Bill, if in terms of your first point of intergenerational equity being at odds with market forces, intergenerational equity considerations are equally at odds with all other systems that we know, as I mentioned in my short time, that complexity economics fights with the Marxian as well as with the market economy. So if you dig deep, not only the pursuit of capital return or profit maximization in the short term is at odds with intergenerational equity, so is the statist meddling and micromanaging of people's life in terms of the decision that make in the face of uncertainty and incomplete information. So if you look at the mess that the Eastern Europe created into the environment and the people's life, individuality and personal respect, and it's as bad as what the West did to human dignity in a different form. So complexity economics in brief challenges both of them. And I'm no longer a defendant of one or the other. I believe we need to move on in an adaptive way, learn the lessons that we have paid heavily for. So I fully agree with your observation. I just want to balance it that by default we must not then say because one is at fault, the other one is, which has been the history of our evolution up to now, and many millions of people have paid heavily for. In terms of philosophical roots of right and left, yes, if you dig that thing, you're absolutely right. I use the term right and left in the economic, political economy sense, around which over the past 150 years we have created two competing governance regimes. And in both of them we have seen spectacular failures of different types, nonetheless no less harmful to intergenerational equity. That's the notion that I was using, right and left, not in a philosophical, existential manner in which you want to dig in. And therefore, I stayed with the mandate of my research, which was how do we deal with issues of intergenerational equity. So, in terms of gender and sexual orientation and poverty, essentially when the system, this is my understanding, when a society does not have a code of honor and norms of practice, it doesn't matter, it doesn't discriminate against subgroupings within the society. Those who are less powerful, they get squashed. And the less power they have, the more they are discriminated against. So the system is not necessarily sitting and contriving against the lesbians and the gays, the male and the female. They say, look, who is good for my political power? Who is father to my system? If they feed my sustained control of the power, I'll support them. If they are too few, too irrelevant, too this, too that, you then discriminate more or neglect them. And therefore, if we look at over the past 200 years, we see that women have been on the receiving end of social injustice. They still are. Not only in South Africa, that our constitution says otherwise, in many societies, from Switzerland to the United States to wherever, pick any society of your choice. All the surveys suggest that after 100 years of, or more than 100 years of women or equal rights for gender, we still see, even in those well-established societies, there is no such a thing as equality. So we got still a long way to go, we're on the right path, and when it comes to other groupings, there are equal ironies that even societies where their constitution guides them otherwise, professes otherwise, they practice differently. And hence my emphasis here that we must move beyond what we profess. We should make sure that what we profess and what we practice are the same. And we often look at our political leaders and say, look what the minister said and what the president said. But let's go to our families. With respect to gender, with respect to sexual orientation, with respect to any subject of our choice. And ask a very simple question in front of the mirror. Forget about them. Do I practice those at home? Do I really do it in my office space, in my workplace, in my company, etc., etc.? So we've still got a long way to go. I don't have more tangible evidence than just a principal observation that we make. In terms of how do we develop these codes of practice or codes of honor, clearly it cannot be prescriptive. Surely, if we want to ultimately adopt, it has to be participatory, and it has to be based on a blend of what we all regard as something that I like, and I'm prepared to adopt. But interestingly enough, this is my personal position, that we will be surprised if we put 18 tribes in South Africa, or 19, or however many they are, and bring their selected representative, whoever they think represents them. We would be very surprised to see how much in common we have. None of those tribes professes to like corruption. None of them promotes theft. All of them adhere, profess to integrity, to honesty, to truthfulness, to humanity, right? So profession, at the profession level, at the formal level, we have agreement very good, I submit. It's at the level of putting it into practice, internalizing it, to the point that, for example, when a chief executive is caught colluding, does not hire the most expensive and most capable lawyer. It goes and submits his or her resignation because it has violated the code of ethics. A teacher who is incapable of teaching will submit his or her resignation because I'm not able to teach. I can assure you I will submit my resignation immediately if you appoint me as the captain of a 747 airplane. I'll do it instantly. Why? Because my life is at stake. It's not because of code of honor. If you can then help me grow to a point that I'll do it from a code of honor point of view, that we won't have CEO of hospitals where facilities fail, they hang on to the job because it pays well, or they are politically connected. We won't find MECs who manipulate to outdo another comrade from the organization. And we won't have chief executives who step on the body and shoulder of their competitors. We need to get to a code of honor in our churches, in our schools, in our families, in our business, public and private organizations. How do we arrive at? I'm not an expert. All I'm suggesting based on my research, if we don't find it, we are onto a default mode future. And default mode future is a very dangerous situation. Because it perpetuates, like poverty, it degenerates to its lowest and weakest denominator. That's my biggest one. I don't know if I answered your question or philosophized even more. But maybe you have some inputs, but maybe there are experiences that we can learn from.
But isn't the nature of complex adaptive systems that there is uncertainty, and the more uncertainty, the more things that evolve, and it's perhaps looking at the things that evolve that actually sustain themselves, and the ones that don't.
If you look at the research that I referred to, and if you're interested, I really appeal to you to read it because I'm no expert in biology, etc., etc. But all the research shows that if the nature of human being theory is a conditional cooperator and an altruistic punisher, therefore it is possible that within a group of us, we will conditionally cooperate and agree to comply with a set of codes of ethics. And at the same time, provided we have enough measures for altruistic punishment if cases of violation emerges. And that has to not only be done, but also to be seen to be done. Then we will comply. And when we comply, our children, our offsprings will know nothing better. And this, as I understand it, the story of the complexity economics, which builds on the nature of human being, is that if we agree that us as human beings are true irrespective of race, gender, wealth, heritage, etc., if we are truly conditional collaborators and altruistic punishers, we will submit to a set of codes of practice, provided those two conditions prevail systemically, and we are prepared to pass on that learning adaptively to our children. Over the past 20 years, South Africa provides a fantastic example of this. I came to South Africa in the early 80s, where you could cut it through the air, racism, unconditional. Then comes the early 90s, we went through a honeymoon of superficial reconciliation and superficial loving each other and putting aside our differences. So we did submit to a set of code that we agreed, the code of denying or staying away from racism and racist talk. We even banned some terminologies and so on and so forth. So we agreed to it. Now we've got to go to the next stage. What else can we agree on in an adaptive, evolutionary way? This romantic that an event happens and if the event doesn't work out, the heaven will fall, and that's not real. It's not a bad thing that we run into crisis now, because we realized that we complied with the first layer of logic, which was existentially important. We had to survive in order to see another day, in order to evolve further. We've now gone to a loop. We've survived. Now we've got to find ways of adapting in order to prosper, not to exist. I don't know if it makes sense. I have absolutely no doubt that within South Africa, across all shades and grades, we have more than enough commitment to humanity and to prosperity that will find those codes. It's not up to me to prescribe or to anybody else for that.
Hi, I'm from Stellenbosch University. I'm a music educator. I'm a human shield for South African education. And the reason I say that is because everyone who comments on education doesn't hold tertiary education accountable. Everyone is focusing on schooling, and schooling essentially is to make children happy. Even if they pay 261,000 rand a year for a matric, what does a matric give you in South Africa? So there are things that need to be decoded to say that if those children are getting access to grade R in that foundation phase, they are getting all those praxial implicit ways of learning. As you speak that we're moving away from the duality and the binaries of seeing things, what is then our modus operandi is going to be the approach of praxial. But everyone is panicking because the dogma is leading the room. So I really appreciate that you have mixed this idea of philosophy within how we do things, because we are moving away from the linear that says here, now, step by step, you will be controlled. And those welfare states survive on that. The big brother is in their lives. So we need to just relax on always criticizing South African education. It is the best that it's ever been. That is the reality. Because those who wanted better, they had to pay the 261,000 per year for a matric.
Thank you.
Name's Guy King. I think the only way out in the medium term is going to be through debt, creation of debt, in respect of dealing with poverty and the whole gamut of issues around it. I want to know from you what you think the future of this debt will look like. How much will it be? How will we deal with it?
Thank you, Ananda, for your indulgence. My question is related to the last one. I was very interested in what you were saying in relation to the investment in infrastructure and your concern about how we fund this. I have a big concern myself when it comes to us borrowing more in order for us to build our power stations. I would be quite interested in your view of how, as a country, and you've mentioned our huge natural resource base, how we could be funding our infrastructure development differently. I see, for example, the problem in Johannesburg around e-tolling seems to relate to the issue of how the ordinary person is now being made to pay for the infrastructure when in fact they were not involved in the decisions that led to the indebtedness. I'm quite worried about us handing over a big debt to the future generations on the basis that we're building our infrastructure. How can we do better?
Criticizing education, I fully understand and agree with your observation that from a systemic social point of view, the education system has been the best ever has been on average, because we're comparing the system now with the apartheid system. Black with the white, public with the private. The $300 whatever you have to pay. I'm not on that page at all. I'm on the page that where the global economy and technology is going. Both the private sector and the public sector, both the black and the white, the curriculum is out of sync with the emerging and emergent pattern of doing business and the skill requirement. I am worried.
Is that tertiary's responsibility?
It's not tertiary's responsibility. It is a national responsibility. I do not talk about the education system in the language of primary, secondary, and tertiary. I'm talking about human resource development, of which there are various components. It starts in the family, it goes to primary school, it goes to secondary school, it goes to the university, it goes to the next university, which is the acquisition of the skills as opposed to knowledge. Since I did my PhD, I have done the equivalent of 5 PhDs in learning and research in practice. And I've proven myself wrong over and over and over again. Had I stopped when I got my PhD, today I would be poor. I would actually retire poor. And I'm confessing it. Right? And I don't think I don't think anyhow, I don't believe that I'm so out of it, so that my degree wasn't good enough or what. You know what I mean? The game is changing. Are we changing the curriculum, or are we stuck in a historic comparative that is itself lived beyond this sell-by date? That's the debate. The debate is not between black and white. My problem is that when I look at the interviews that I do in my limited, like an ant in South Africa, my business is that small. But every so often when I interview from white universities, capable, lineage, rich, black and white, when I ask them a few questions that I've learned since I did my PhD, I see they're not with it. When I go to our university, then I see, what are you teaching now? My old colleagues. Or occasionally I get for my sins to do a lecture here and there, sit on a panel and in there, a symbolic sort of moonlighting, which I don't get paid for, but I enjoy it. So when I ask, what are you guys teaching? Right? They're out of it. United States, forget about South Africa. 5 years ago, the United States education system was out of it. When President Obama came, the first intervention that did from an intergenerational point of view was to awaken the giant. And today, 5 years later, you go to the public school in the United States, they are doing 5 times as our best private school is doing. Yeah, they are catching up. We are still debating something else. So yes, I don't want to dismiss your question, but I'm saying let's move the debate to the next generation. This debate is about the past. I'm talking about our children. So that's my position on it, and I believe we have a bit of homework to do there. In terms of debt financing, and if I may just, for the sake of time, link the two, absolutely right. We cannot do what we need to do, which is accumulated, as I mentioned, and in the chapter of quantified or shown the trend. It is frightening. 40 years of underinvestment requires for the next few years to put all of our GDPs into catch-up. It's not practical. Debt is inevitable. Therefore, before we incur any debt, we need to make sure that we reconfigure the system. I'm not worried about debt. You know, all of us who have come from poor families, myself first, how did I get to build myself? Not because my parents had money, I had to borrow. I had to work and borrow more than work a little bit and so on to make it happen, right? But when I borrowed, what was the condition that made me succeed? And I'm not bragging, I'm just using myself so nobody else gets upset. I had to make absolutely sure that every cent that I use it carefully. I took buses as opposed to taxis. I took third grade train as opposed to second grade. Why? Because I borrowed this. So I used it most productively. I'm not worried at all that we have a backlog of social infrastructure, both social and economic infrastructure, and we have no choice but to borrow it. But before we borrow and bequeath to our future generation debt and nothing else, I like to suggest that we should get the code of honor in place. That the way we spend this money is when I borrowed money to do it, not with blue lights, not with first-class travels and presidential planes and subcontractors who pay this stuff. Kusile and Medupi should have costed a third of what we pay for it and bequeathed to our nation, to our children. You've got to get to that level of probity. I think the language is probity of public use. Custodianship of public money should be done with the same stinginess that I was worried that I'm going to run out of money end of the month and will have money to survive. That's not a theoretical thing, that's a practical thing. Will we get our ministers as first code of conduct to say this nation is too poor, our accumulated backlog is too much, so let's do the following as part of bringing the knives out. Let's make sure that every minister and public office holder will do a dignified, but to the absolute bare minimum. Not Mercedes and Audis and 4x4s. A B class, what I'm used to, which has got air conditioning, which has got power steering, and that's about perfect for me. I travel in that. South Africa can only afford for ministers and DGs and chief executives B-grade official cars. They can only, at best, have one driver. No bag carriers, no bodyguards. You're not at war. Why do you want the bodyguards? The Norway and the Swedish ministers go to school, go to the offices by bicycle. That's what they can afford. That's what they demonstrate. I'm not saying they mustn't live in their private life the way they like. I'm not totalitarian. I'm saying when it comes to public money, take note that we have a backlog, we have to borrow to pay it, and when you live on borrowed money, you'll spend it differently than when you have grannies left with a few billions. That's the mode that we have to go to. Come to the business, the same principle. What's the dignified but minimum requirements that we have to live comfortably, but to reconstruct our broken past? Ma'am, am I answering your question? So don't worry about borrowing, but before borrowing, and I can tell you as an activist, an active member of financial capital market would not hesitate to lend us if they know that when we're going to spend it, we will build productive capacity. The reason bank gives us bank student loan is not because they like us, because they know that, and they make a judgment, a risk assessment, and say, okay, dentistry, yeah, this fellow will study hard for 5-6 years, but after that, pump money. I'll get my loan back. They lend you. But if you're a dentistry student and get the money and go and have a party, you'll go broke. So loan is not a bad thing. And the fact that we have enough endowment, natural endowment, not only mineral, but other natural endowments of sun and for clean energy, of coast for tourism, agriculture land, technology, and human capability, believe it or not. These are all the things that we have to gear up. But you can only make productive gearing of it to the satisfaction of your lenders only if you get the code of practice right. You mess up a Kusida for triple the price that it has to be, or build eToll for 2.5 times the price that it be. Next time that you come to borrow from me, I'm saying, welcome and a cup of coffee, sir, but no thank you, or I'll lend you at 2.5 times what you should be getting. Which means future generations are going to even pay more. But what other options have I got than conveying to you that, my friend, you're not managing your money well? Do I make sense, sir? So don't be afraid of backlog, don't be afraid of shortage of money. We can reconstruct it. But let's get the code of engagement, the code of honor right, so we can build the integrity of resource utilization, both in private and public sector.
Thank you. Wow, thank you very much. I'm sure there will be an opportunity afterwards if you want to, have further conversation with Dr. Iraj. You'll be, I'm sure, is welcome to that to continue the conversation with him as well. Now I'm going to hand over to Jan Wafmeyer, Program Manager of the Policy and Analysis.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to be very brief. These fascinating insights that Iraj has shared with us comes from a publication called the Transformation Audit. It's a publication that we bring out every year, and it focuses on 4 key areas. We look at macroeconomic policy, a chapter that Iraj has contributed. We look at the labor market. We look at skills and education, and also the extent to which we are making progress or not in the battle against poverty and inequality. Now, this year's publication focused on the theme, or had the prism of combating or confronting exclusion. And this theme basically comes from our own research, our own public survey data that shows that South Africans primarily feel threatened by the extent to which they are materially excluded, and that also impacts on our relations with each other. So this has got a broader impact than just the economic. It also impacts on how we relate to each other and how cohesive we are as a society or not. So to be sure, I think if one also looks at the findings of this publication, it paints a very sort of complex, nuanced picture that Iraj also points out. It's not only a question of left and right or black and white, it's much more complex. And therefore I think this kind of publication, we want to bring it out and also make it part of the public discourse for people to engage with it and make it part of this discourse, specifically the issue of intergenerational justice, which I think has been underexplored in our public discourse. We have very pressing needs at present, the questions of poverty and inequality, and also the question of unemployment that underpins this. But we cannot forget about the future. There are future generations that also has to build on from where we are right now. So I would really recommend that you engage with this article of Iraj's. It will be on our website from today, I think right after this meeting. I will also ask Iraj whether we can use his speech and put that also on our website. Iraj.
With pleasure, it's yours.
Thanks very much for that. So, and then I would also like to encourage you also to look at some of the other contributions in this year's publication. There's one on executive accountability in the education system, which is critical because it underpins a lot of the things that we've talked about and is specifically relevant to the question of intergenerational justice. There's an article on wage formation that is relevant right now as the strike on the platinum belt continues, and there is a standoff, it seems, between business and unions. And then there's also an article on hunger and food security, specifically related to the homelands, but also looking more broadly at South Africa. And this is, again, very relevant if one just sort of looks at the news last night, reporting on worrying food inflation figures, which also has an implication also for social stability in South Africa. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would really encourage you to go through this publication, digest it, and we would also appreciate your feedback on this in order also to make it a publication that improves every year. And before I say goodbye, I just want to thank Ayanda as well, who has been co-editor of this publication, also for bringing a publication, a quality publication like this, together, and also organizing this morning's events. Thank you very much for your
Thanks, Jan. Seeing that we're doing thank yous and whatnot, I would also like to thank all my colleagues that have really been behind me in putting this event together. We don't have our program administrator here, Margot Newman, to say thank you to her as well. Also our communications and strategy unit, Ziana, our media coordinator. Thank you very much. Also to Jazeda, our fundraising officer. This also made sure that we have the relevant people in the room. Also to our office manager and also our housekeeper, they've really just been a great help in trying to make today's event a success. So thank you very much, and thank you to everybody for making it out this morning. We appreciate it. Thanks.